Banks are no longer debating if stablecoins matter. They're now asking to scale them as part of their core financial infrastructure. As global trend, it's clear regulation is enabling, not hindering, and stablecoins are moving into mission-critical payment and settlement flows. And for more on this, we can speak to Stephen Richardson, Chief Strategy Officer and Head of Banking, Fireblocks. Hello, Stephen. Welcome to Sibos TV. I hope you've been enjoying Frankfurt over recent days as much as we have here. Now, banks have moved beyond asking why stablecoins matter and are now focused on how to scale them. What factors have driven this shift in strategic thinking and at the leadership level?
Yeah, so I think most clearly it's around the utility around the use case. I think when stablecoins launched, they were quite niche in terms of solving problems for crypto native players. Over the last few years, you started to see stablecoins be utilized by payments firms, PSPs, as a mechanism of really enabling both retail and SMB type payments on a cross-border level, right? And there's real utility in terms of speed, transparency, and costs for utilizing stablecoins. And so as you started to see a shift in that model, as you started to see clarity around regulation in places like the US with the Genius Act, in the EU with MiCA, in places like Hong Kong towards Japan and Singapore, I think there's now regulatory clarity to engage with this new asset on chain. And there's a commercial opportunity that we've seen as being viable in terms of really solving some of the pain points around money movement for corporates and for retail. And so I think this is galvanizing the business to really look at the opportunity that exists and to look at the areas of value proposition that a bank can add in terms of utilizing a stablecoin.
Now, we've seen institutions like Banking Circle and Societe Generale launch their own MiCA-compliant stablecoins. Bancolombia issue COPW in Latin America and SMBC in Japan assessing the feasibility of leveraging stablecoins for wholesale payments between financial institutions and businesses. But what common themes or lessons are emerging from these very different markets?
Yeah, so I think it's again around utility, right? As you think about MiCA, right, you think about the basis of something that fits within the European Central Bank framework. If you think about the US and the Genius Act, it's really built around enabling payments type innovation. And in Latin America, as an emerging basis, right, the ability to solve some of the pain points around money movement for corporates within emerging markets, right? And then if you look at a place like Japan, where there's a lot of international trade, it's really how can you optimize those flows, right? And so offering a service across each of these, again, relies on the utility for the consumer and for the corporate. And I think that's really where it comes from, right? In terms of why these different institutions are exploring it and why folks are starting to integrate stablecoins from an acceptance point of view, also from a distribution point of view in financial services.
Now, you've previously said that regulation is actually enabling, not hindering. But how the frameworks like Genius Act in the US, MiCA in Europe, and the recent introduction of the stablecoin ordinance in Hong Kong shaping the way banks approach stablecoins at the moment?
So it provides a bit of clarity in terms of the asset that you're utilizing, right? So I think if you look at pre-regulatory framework, there was a lot of questions on were these stablecoins fully funded? A lot of the issuers of these stablecoins were doing attestations through auditing firms. They were auditing themselves. They were utilizing technology around deposit verification. And that was very different, like in terms of a scalable asset, right? As you start to think about the Genius Act and others, it provides clarity on what is considered a stablecoin, what backs a stablecoin, and then how can you think about, the trustworthiness of that asset, right, in terms of being a regulated asset that's on chain. And so that changes the kind of scaling framework that can be behind it. It also changes the kind of interactions from a financial services level because you now have issuers that are regulated that can go to banks who might act as fiat custodians and say, listen, we're a regulated stablecoin. We would love to be able to back our fiat dollars and utilize services from the bank to acquire things like treasuries to back those assets, which gives us additional scale in the marketplace, right, where some of the capacity before was limited. So I think having that regulatory overview, right, and clarity that you can engage with this technology and with this new asset class provides the scale that we think is necessary to really grow the utility of the tool.
Now, when Fireblocks talk about infrastructure being the next frontier via enterprise-grade custody, compliance, and connectivity, what does that actually look like for a bank trying to live with stablecoins?
Yeah, so I think at its core, right, the wallet infrastructure is what we think is key to launching any business, right? If you think about it at a basis, the ability to have a wallet means the ability to interact with a blockchain, which provides information on where an asset exists. It also provides clarity in terms of utilizing that asset, the ability to sign a transaction, to move the asset from one wallet to another. And so that becomes critical at a foundational level. I think after that, you're then starting to build tools on top of that, whether it's payments orchestration, the ability to issue a stablecoin through things like tokenization. And so, for us, that foundational level is necessary. And then what you start to think about from a bank level is the ability to create really strong user experiences, both at a retail level, but also at a corporate and commercial level that allow people to really find the utility in utilizing the stablecoin. So whether that is accessing different VAS within a network, whether that is the ability to move funds from your DDA account and then mint a stablecoin, whether that's things like FX, so ability to move between currencies and on and off ramps, those toolings and that UX UI experience then becomes something that really makes the asset work, right? And provides the global distribution and the global scale that's necessary. So I think that's where we see the opportunity, core wallet infrastructure at a baseline, but then services that can be deployed by the banks and by financial institutions on top of that wallet infrastructure.
Now, Fireblocks is working with 80 banks, over 80 banks worldwide at the moment on pilots as well as production scale deployments. Where are you seeing the strongest demand right now? And what role do you play in helping institutions move their digital asset initiatives forward?
I think when you looked at banking before, really stablecoins represent the first real commercial use case, right, outside of speculative crypto trading per se, right? And obviously in the U.S., where we anticipate things around the Clarity Act, there's been more of a movement by broker dealers and others to engage in more crypto trading. But at a banking level and things like corporate transactional banking, stablecoins represent an opportunity to add a new service on a basis that's more efficient, right? And so a lot of the pilots that we're seeing today focus around things like tokenized deposits within large-scale banks where there are multiple subsidiaries, and a tokenized deposit would be helpful for enabling money movement internally, and then integrating that against something like a stablecoin where you have a more open network system. And so, the banks there are really looking to understand how these different tools fit together, these different assets on chain fit together, and corporate payments, for example, is a pretty significant use case that we're seeing arise right now.
You've mentioned helping banks define the standards for the future of finance. What are the critical standards that need to be established for stablecoins to become truly mainstream in payments and settlement?
Look, I think you always think about things like KYC and AML risk, right? How do you really define who you're interacting with, right? How do you ensure that transactions are going to the right place and that you're not utilizing funds on a malicious basis? I think things like on-chain identity will start to become important, right? So obviously banks have significant KYC data on their users, and the ability to tie that into on-chain data and wallets, I think becomes a critical basis. So you can envision a world similar to what we have now with P2P payments. Think about Zelle in the United States, where you're onboarded via a bank, and then you have a unique identifier that's tied to that banking information, and then you're able to send an asset across. That asset in the future might look like a stable coin, right? And so the ability to really scale out that infrastructure over time, we think is really important. And then the ability to really map the networking and messaging, so things that Swift does really well today, to be correlated to on-chain transactions becomes another important part of a piece of the puzzle in terms of scaling out the use case for stablecoins for corporates.
Now I'm going to ask you to look ahead, Stephen. If we were to reflect on this conversation in 5 years' time, what would you expect the stablecoin landscape to be in banking to be looking like at that stage?
Look, I think it's a good view around being highly interoperable, and I think this goes back to the wallet infrastructure at first basis. So, at Fireblocks, we support over 100 blockchains, and the ability for a bank to say, we don't really care where that asset is issued in terms of blockchain, but we're able to support that asset and recognize it becomes one thing. As you think about token issuance and ability to have things like cross-chain interoperability, I think that's important. I think in 5 years, the UX UI experience should say, we don't really care who issued the asset. We don't care which blockchain it is on, but we're able to recognize it and move it seamlessly, such that a retail consumer or corporate consumer is not necessarily concerned or sees this asset as a separate asset from their fiat funds today, right? It's just an asset that moves value around more seamlessly and instantaneously. And that's what's exciting, and that's what we anticipate to be the future of payments and on-chain finance.
Well, hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that for real in 5 years' time, in 5 Sibos' time. But thank you so much for giving us some time here in Frankfurt. I hope you had a great week, and you make the most of the next few hours as things come to a close. That's Stephen Richardson, Chief Strategy Officer and Head of Banking, Fireblocks. Thank you once again, mate.
Thanks for having me.